Imagine for a moment that everything you've been taught about God is wrong. Yes, wrong. This is not blasphemy, but an invitation to think differently, to break the chains that bind our minds to concepts that perhaps have been imposed on us without question. Baruch Spinoza, that 17th century Jewish philosopher, that man who was excommunicated from his community for daring to think beyond established boundaries, proposed a revolutionary idea. God neither rewards nor punishes. How is that possible? Many will ask. Since childhood, we've been taught that our actions have divine consequences, that if we do good, we will be rewarded, and if we sin, we will suffer eternal punishment. But what if this conception of a God with human characteristics, with emotions like anger or satisfaction, were nothing more than a projection of our own fears and desires? Spinoza dared to challenge this paradigm, and for that, he was rejected, condemned to ostracism. Because when you question the foundations of traditional faith, when you propose a vision of God that doesn't align with the official narrative, you touch very sensitive fibers. But what was so revolutionary about his proposal? Why does it continue to cause irritation among the most conservative religious circles? The answer is simple and at the same time profoundly complex. Spinoza invites us to free ourselves from fear, to understand that our relationship with the divine is not mediated by a system of rewards and punishments, as if we were children in a cosmic school. And in that liberation, perhaps, we also find the path to our true personal development. To understand the revolution of Spinoza's thought, we must first comprehend what he really proposed, and it's here where many are surprised, where many feel the ground beneath their feet begin to tremble. For Spinoza, God is not a being separate from nature, not a judge seated on a celestial throne, observing our actions with approval or disgust. For Spinoza, God and nature are one and the same thing. Deus salve natura. God, that is, nature. Do you perceive the magnitude of this statement? We're talking about a God who is not outside, but within everything that exists. A God who is the very substance of the universe, who expresses himself through infinite attributes, of which we perceive only two: thought and extension. The nature of God, wrote Spinoza, is a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and infinite essence. When we understand this, when we truly assimilate it, the idea of a God who rewards or punishes vanishes like mist before the sun. Because how could the totality of being punish or reward itself? It's as if the ocean decided to punish one of its waves for being too high, or reward another for being perfectly symmetrical. It makes no sense, because the wave is the ocean, and the ocean is the wave. And here is where many religious people feel that something precious is being taken from them. The comfort of a personal God who cares for them, who guides them, who rewards them when they are good and punishes them when they stray from the path. But what Spinoza offers us in return is not emptiness. It is not hopelessness. It is perhaps a higher form of connection with the divine, a relationship based not on fear of punishment or hope for a reward, but on understanding, on the intellectual love of God. And in that love, in that deep understanding of our belonging to something greater than ourselves, we can find a serenity that no external reward could ever provide us. But perhaps you wonder, if God neither rewards nor punishes. What happens then with our actions? Is everything random, devoid of consequences? Nothing could be further from Spinoza's vision. In his universe, everything is determined by necessity, by the natural laws that govern existence. Our actions have consequences, yes, but these are not divine rewards or punishments. They are simply the natural effects that derive from our acts, like the stone that falls to the ground, not because God punishes it for rising, but because the law of gravity operates unfailingly. In nature, there is nothing contingent, but all things are determined by the necessity of the divine nature to exist and operate in a certain way, affirmed the philosopher. Let's think of it this way. When we touch fire, we get burned, not because a vengeful God is punishing us for our imprudence, but because that is the nature of fire and our skin. The consequence is inherent to the action itself. Similarly, when we act with kindness, when we cultivate relationships based on respect and love, we experience a serenity, a fullness that is not an external reward, but the natural consequence of living in harmony with our deepest nature. And here is where Spinoza is centuries ahead of modern psychology. He understood that our happiness, our well-being, does not depend on external rewards, but on the internal coherence of our actions. Isn't it liberating? Imagine living without the constant weight of divine judgment, without the anxiety of accumulating merits or demerits in a celestial accounting. Imagine instead simply flowing with nature, understanding its laws and living in accordance with them. Happiness is not the reward of virtue, wrote Spinoza, but virtue itself. We don't do good to be happy afterwards. We are happy in the very act of doing good, because that act is in harmony with the divine nature that is also our own nature. In that deep understanding resides a form of freedom that no promise of heaven or threat of hell could ever offer us. It's fascinating to observe how this vision of Spinoza directly confronts our deepest fears. Because, let's be honest, what is it that really terrifies us about the idea of a God who punishes? It is the fear of being judged, of being found insufficient, of suffering eternally for our mistakes. This fear has been used for centuries as a tool of control. Behave well, or God will punish you. How many of us grew up hearing similar phrases, and although the intention might be noble, to guide us toward a virtuous life, the result is often a spirituality based on fear, not on love. Spinoza offers us an alternative, one where our relationship with the divine is not mediated by fear, but by knowledge, by the understanding of our own nature and our place in the universe. The knowledge of God, he wrote, is the supreme good of the soul. Not the fear of God, not blind obedience, but knowledge, the deep understanding that we are part of something greater, that we participate in the divine nature in our own measure. And you know what happens when we replace fear with knowledge? We free ourselves. We stop acting well out of fear of punishment and begin to act well because we understand that it is what is in harmony with our true nature. It's as if all our lives we had been driving with the handbrake on, and suddenly we release it. The same energy that was previously consumed in anxiety, in guilt, in fear, now flows freely toward creativity, toward love, toward fullness. Think about it. How much vital energy do we spend worrying about whether our actions will be good enough in the eyes of a judging God? How much do we limit ourselves for fear of crossing invisible lines that others have drawn for us? Spinoza's proposal invites us to redirect that energy, to direct it not toward external approval, be it human or divine, but toward the understanding of our own essence, toward the fullest expression of our being. And in that expression, in that authenticity, we find a joy that no external reward could match. Now, it's understandable that this vision provokes resistance, especially in those whose identity, whose sense of security, is deeply intertwined with the traditional idea of a God who rewards and punishes. When Spinoza proposed these ideas, he was excommunicated from his Jewish community, with one of the most severe anathemas remembered. They called him a heretic. They forbade him any contact with his family and friends. No one could approach him within less than 4 cubits distance. Why such virulence? Because Spinoza was touching something deeper than a mere theological doctrine. He was questioning the very structure of religious power. If God doesn't reward or punish, if there is no supreme judge who delegates his authority to earthly representatives, then what role do religious intermediaries play? Men, wrote Spinoza, are accustomed to form universal ideas, both of natural and artificial things, ideas which they consider as models at which nature looks to operate and which they themselves use to understand. In other words, we create mental models and then act as if those models were reality itself. And perhaps one of the most powerful models we have created is that of an anthropomorphic God with human emotions amplified to infinity, an unconditional love, but also a terrible anger, a limitless generosity, but also a capacity for eternal punishment. Spinoza invites us to see beyond that model, to recognize it as a human construction, not as the ultimate reality. And here is where his philosophy becomes not only theologically revolutionary, but existentially liberating. Because when we stop projecting our own emotions, fears, and desires onto an external God, we begin to assume responsibility for our own life. We can no longer say, I am suffering because God is punishing me, or I am fortunate because God is rewarding me. Instead, we must face reality as it is, complex, sometimes chaotic, governed by natural laws that do not take into account our personal desires. And in that confrontation, in that acceptance of reality, without the consolation of a Godfather who fixes everything, we paradoxically find a deeper form of peace. Let's think now about what it really means to live with this understanding, how it transforms not only our relationship with the divine, but also our relationship with ourselves and with others. When we stop living in terms of external rewards and punishments, when we stop acting motivated by fear or the hope of a reward, we begin to act from a more authentic place, more aligned with our true nature. Spinoza expressed it with amazing clarity. Human freedom does not consist in free will, but in the mode of existence according to which our actions are determined by our own nature, by our essence, and not by external causes. In other words, we are free not when we do what we want, but when we do what is in accordance with our deepest essence. And that essence, according to Spinoza, is part of the divine nature, part of that unique substance that is God or nature. Imagine for a moment what a society would be like, where everyone acted from this understanding, where the motivation for good was not the fear of hell or the hope of heaven, but the deep understanding that our well-being is intrinsically connected to the well-being of all beings. Because if God is nature and we are part of that nature, then we are all connected at a fundamental level. What we do to others, we do to ourselves, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a metaphysical reality. This vision of interconnection, of unity underlying all the diversity of the world, is perhaps Spinoza's most powerful legacy for our time. In an era of extreme individualism, where everyone seems to be locked in their own bubble of self-interest, Spinoza's philosophy reminds us that we are not separate, isolated entities, but modes or expressions of the same fundamental reality. And in that reminder, there is not only a profound philosophical truth, but also a practical guide to living with greater fullness, with greater authenticity, with greater connection. We come to the end of our journey through this revolutionary idea of Spinoza, and perhaps now we can understand why, more than 3 centuries after his death, his ideas continue to generate so much controversy, so much rejection in certain religious circles. Because what Spinoza proposes is not a simple theological adjustment. It is a complete reformulation of our relationship with the divine, with the universe, and with ourselves. The ultimate end of man, he wrote, is not to dominate other beings, but to understand our own nature, to understand the laws of the universe, to understand that we are part of something much greater than ourselves. And in that understanding, in that deep comprehension, we find not only wisdom, but also liberation. We free ourselves from the paralyzing fear of divine punishment. We free ourselves from the constant anxiety of accumulating merits for a future reward. We free ourselves, ultimately, from an infantile relationship with the divine. And what do we find in its place? A more mature, deeper, more authentic love. A love that Spinoza called intellectual love of God. A love not based on fear or hope, but on understanding. This is Spinoza's legacy for us today. An invitation to grow spiritually, to move from a relationship with the divine based on rewards and punishments to a relationship based on understanding and love. It is not an easy path. It requires that we abandon the securities of an infantile faith, that we face uncertainty, that we assume responsibility for our own lives. But perhaps, as Spinoza suggested, it is the only path to true freedom, toward that beatitude that he described as the highest state of the human being. And maybe, just maybe, in this moment of global crisis, ecological, social, spiritual, the ideas of this philosopher excommunicated more than 300 years ago have something essential to offer us. A new way of understanding ourselves and our relationship with the whole. A way that doesn't divide us, that doesn't confront us, but that reminds us of our fundamental unity. Because if God is nature, and we are part of that nature, then everything is connected. And in that deep connection, perhaps, lies our greatest hope for the future.